Mother's cousin lives over there. She's gone now, but she and I wrote letters to each other when we were in grade school, and we didn't know each other at all. And then finally, we lost track of each other for about 50 years. And then through heritage people, they're looking up our family tree. I found her and wrote to her, and then I visited them over in Badau, Switzerland. We landed in Zurich and then stayed at the Solbergers, which were my friends. And I remember the buildings. There was a farm, and the house and the barn were together, and it was modern. It was the old building, but it was modernized inside. And that was what amazed me so, was these old buildings that were in such perfect condition. And stayed there a few days and went on to Badau to my cousin, who was very worried about seeing me because she didn't think I could talk in Swiss. She talked to my friend over the phone because I had her call her, tell her I was coming, and I was glad enough already. And so she said, well, I've been through many crises, but I think I can get through this one. And so I got there, and then I got to talking to him, and I talked to Bern Beach, which I'm not very good at. But she was so happy to think that I could talk a little bit, and she called up all the relatives, and she said that I could talk Bern Beach. So maybe you don't want to hear any more, no, but that's the first beginning of when I was there.
Oh,
and it was in the Emmental Valley. It was near Langnau and Badau, and it's such a beautiful place.
When you were corresponding with this cousin years and years ago, what language did you write back?
I wrote in English and she wrote in Swiss. So we both had interpreters, you know. So my grandmother, who never spoke English in her life, she would interpret the letter to me, and she had English people over there. And so.
Did anybody here ever correspond with anyone in German?
A little bit.
A little bit. Mm-hmm. Speaking of German, somebody brought in a catechism, or no, an ABC book. Who was that?
I know.
Could you show that, hold it up, and talk a little bit about that? Did you use that yourself, or was it one of your?
It was my father's.
Okay.
And I think he used it when he went to the Apostolic Church to Sunday school. Now,
We used that when we went.
for our children, to have them, you say a word to them, and they have a terrible time twisting their tongue, they say, to say the word. But still the grandchildren, the little ones, are able to follow our word more than what when they're real small and real young, then they can, not that we can teach them to talk, but at least they,
I had a question. You said that was used in the Sunday school at the Apostolic Christian Church. If I have the facts right, I believe that one of the founders of the local congregation was a brother of one of the founders of the Baptist Church.
You are right.
Was there also a German Sunday school at other churches other than the Apostolic Church? Do we know?
Baptist.
I think the Baptist was German.
Baptist has set up. I wouldn't wonder if we could,
Sunday school, church.
Norwegians, that would definitely.
They wanted that.
Can some of you remember any kind of rhymes or anything you may have learned as you were working through that reader?
You know, what you asked me that last week, and the only I've been thinking of, I hope the man, I hope the man, I hope the man. And I think the kid, and I read it, and then the baby would, laugh at me.
Yeah.
I got one here. Ahmed said, Cotswold to Brøsne, when they kom to the Salpaliwet.
We used to say Roti, Rosalie, and Gata, but then what else?
Rådyrelsen gav mig rikelig våld. When the wind comes to blåse, så skärpen sig bort.
I'd like to just make a comment on the German language that I've been doing a little history on the Methodist Church this summer. And Methodist Church was built in 1915 and 1916. And in the records, I found that the reason that the Methodist Church was built a lot by the townspeople because there was not an English-speaking church in town at the time. And it was the Baptist church was there, and it had been just the German language was being spoken there. So the townspeople felt that it was important to have a church that had the English-speaking language. And also, it also indicated that the war was coming on with Germany, and I don't know just what influence this had, but I think this is why was maybe the first really English-speaking church in town.
Well, there's just an anniversary now, and it's just water coming up.
The Baptist.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know when the Baptists started using the English language in their church.
When did the Apostolic Christian Church begin?
1846. Pretty long time ago.
Yeah.
1846. It's just about the time that Iowa became a state.
Was there a congregation here already that far back?
No, 66.
66.
But
British Church, yeah. So it never was or it wasn't for quite some time an exclusively German church.
No.
You mentioned the war. Do any of you remember anybody, or maybe you yourself remember, situations where Iowa's laws of 1918 prohibiting the use of a foreign language, where that impinged on people in this community?
We had it in school. I don't know about the church, but in school they finally someone could play ball, use the Swiss language, and then all at once when I hear the teacher come out, she said there'll be no more Swiss talking on the school ground or in the schoolhouse anymore. And I probably was, probably 8, 10 years old, something like that.
About what year would that have been, more or less?
What year was that?
Oh,
What year was that in?
well, let's see now, 39.
No, you were born in 20.
I'll be 81 in a few days, so that's about 10, possibly 10 years old. So never.
27,
Yeah.
27, 28, probably.
I hope, yeah.
What about actually during the war? Did anybody ever mistake Swiss for German sympathizers or anything like that?
That happened up in our neighborhood.
When you say our neighborhood,
Along 56.
okay.
There's Dingley up there, and my dad was one of the only Swiss, Snyder. And there was downright discrimination at that time. I know the guy that run the Highland store, he was a guy named, let's see, Gilson. And he was so against the Swiss, he didn't know the difference between the Germans and the Swiss. And that was one of the mistakes. That store was right at the end of our road, and that's why.
Can any of you think of any time when there was either a real distinct advantage or disadvantage to being Swiss in this community?
But the other people couldn't understand you.
Would a Swiss person, for instance, have preferred to do business with another Swiss person, or was it whoever had the best deal to offer?
I think best you off.
Well, maybe that's typical Swiss.
Last week I gave you, put it on tape, and those businesses that I listed, I told you a whole bunch of them. On good share, those were Swiss. Like the Shorys were all Swiss, and the Lanes were Swiss, and Colders were Swiss, and, well, you name some more. Weigel.
Well, now let me open up a discussion. Paul mentioned the English along Route 56, but I understand that there might have also been a few Norwegians in the adjoining area. What were the relations like between the Norwegians and the Swiss?
Not too good. They don't run the Norwegians down. I suppose the Norwegians did the same thing to the Swiss.
I can tell you a story about that.
Oh, go ahead.
Because the Norwegians were on the other side of the river, and the Swiss were on this side. And there was a walking bridge across the Turkey River. And my grandpa came over to see Swiss girls, and that was not, they didn't like that. And he came over to later see my grandmother. And then one time there's 3 fellows met him on the bridge, and they beat him up when he was coming over. And he was so badly beaten up that he got, after he recovered, well, I got in touch with each one of them and he said, I want to meet you over the bridge, but I want to meet you one at a time. So nobody came.
And when you say the Turkey River, or
Yes.
the Turkey
And
River?
the two young with the Snyder farm went across. When I was young, and I used to go fishing on the Turkey River, the cables were still laying on the banks. But what the idea was, there's the Martys and the Snyders who came to the church, and they walked across that. At one time, they used to ford the river, and at one time, I don't know who it was, or maybe somebody else would tell me, there was a whole team of horses drowned in quicksand when they were on there. So, I'd like to know who it was anymore. But the harness and all that disappeared.
I think the bridge was taken out by a severe flood in 1916 by the Northern Line.
In 1916. Okay, that cable would have been there when I was probably 12 years old. There was a cable laying on the base. But they're long gone or long rusted, I know.
In the questionnaire, there was a section where we asked which language you would prefer to use certain things. If all things were equal, if your partner spoke both languages as well as you do, and there isn't anything urgent about the situation, would you prefer Swiss or would you prefer English to tell about memories from childhood, to discuss your health, to say something intimate to a friend? What are some of the situations where you have felt over the years that you absolutely really wanted to use one language or the other? So that,
Well, I tell you, it costs better in Swiss than you can in English.
well, I won't ask for examples, but what are some of the other things that you feel you can do better?
Oh, we have a card club that started a long time ago.
Oh, which club?
A card club, they pay
Oh.
$500. Was it called what? Which did you say? But they started a long time ago, and originally you had to speak Swiss. You could not speak anything else. And if you did say an English word, you were fined. Because they wanted to preserve the Swiss language. But as the years went on, we sort of got away from it, and I wish they hadn't. Because we still meet, but there's a few words we know how to say.
Well, what are some of the words that have survived?
Well, Elsie helped me. But
50 bucks for up.
50 got down, we gave and said,
If we had bad luck, we'd say that's a shot.
Alice always says, I have to studier. Whatever that is.
Mary Pollock would often say, doesn't just have it to you.
Yeah.
Well, there's one that we always wondered about, and we talked about it in the Swiss Club, and that was not was. Nobody knows what it means.
We still, to our children, and I don't our daughter, well, she's 51, and we still say, if we want a herring knife, we say schnitzel.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know why, but that's a word that
We always have a favorite schnitzel.
yeah, right.
Did you tend more to use Swiss with either people of a certain generation above and below you, or did it have to do with how intimate you were with them, or the nature of what you were discussing? What sort of tripped the switch to go back and forth between one language and the other?
But no, go ahead.
Well, I was, my grandmother lived with us. She was a Swiss lady, and she never talked a word of English. And I was her pal from the time I was a year old till. And we talked Swiss all the time. And when I started school, I was talking Swiss, although I could talk English, but that's how I remembered how to talk when I got to Switzerland, which was, forgot a lot of it, but
Which was the generation where the change came from, mostly?
Well, that's just when I grew up, 7 years ago, but that time there's still quite a lot of Swiss. And it gradually died out. Well, when I went to country school, let's put that straight. I started school at 5. When I was 5, I could not speak a word of English. It just so happened that we had Hilda Martyr, you know her, and she could talk Swiss, and from then on, of course, we just went to English.
Yeah, I was in first grade in World War I. We were forbidden to speak anything else but English.
What would have happened if a child would have spoken something other than English?
We probably got beat up. I was too small to do that.
Anyone else who was in school during the war that has specific memories?
We couldn't speak English when we started to school, but we learned it in school pretty fast. So when we'd get home, we'd probably start amongst the children speak English. Parents would say, "How's your Deutsch?"
Or many
Well, you know, that happened to my dad. They had to register for World War I, you know. And he had his card, you know, his registration card. But he always tells about the story about the sheriff coming to see, checking, and they came up through the timber, you know, we didn't have a road out 56 that day. Come up through your land, up through the timbers. And he had an old car, I pulled him out of the sheet, and it was so rough that he lost his muffler. And Dad wasn't that fun about that.
You have a son that's a pharmacist at St. Luke's Hospital in Cedar Rapids. And our children never spoke, maybe word is about all of Swiss. Otherwise we talked English all the time at home with our family. And my husband had a hip replacement at the hospital. And I was telling one of the nurses, we have a son that's a pharmacist here. And she said, "Who is he?" And I said his name was Richard. And she said, "Oh, I'm wondering if he's the one that speaks with a dialect." And I said, because I never thought our kids would have. And our daughter too, when she went to Waterloo to beautician school, to be a beautician, they always told her, "Just keep talking. We just love to hear her talk. Just talk English and say anything because we just love to hear you talk."
Well, you know.
And that wasn't Swiss. She was speaking English.
You talked about, some of you claim that it's easier to use strong language in Swiss. That may be so, or maybe it isn't so, but what are some of the other things? How many of you, for instance, will sometimes find yourself dreaming in Swiss? Any of you still? Well, Harry, what do you dream about in Swiss? Oh, well, I was looking for more general answers. Would you, for instance, when you dream in Swiss, would it be about things that you're currently experiencing, or would it be more about things you experienced in the past, or?
I'll tell you, I guess probably I would have to say that several times we was in Switzerland, I'd come home and dream about Switzerland, you know, with things that we saw over there. And we was over there 3 times already, and every time that we come back, why, I would dream the next 2-3 nights about the things that we saw in Switzerland, and what was said, you know, on different things, is about what I have to say.
So it's as though there's a certain reservoir there that's waiting to be tapped.
The mountains was even more elaborate in my dream than they was looking at. And buildings and different things like that, you know.
Well, now, do you think that, for instance, this evening you'll dream about interviews and people telling Swiss rhymes?
Well, I don't believe they come back, no. No.
What about counting? Did all of you count in English, or did some of you count in Swiss?
I never counted in Swiss, but when you said that, I remembered that we tried to teach my grandmother. We would go, when we went to high school all 4 years, we stayed with my grandmother during the week. And we wanted to teach her how to count in English. And she did real well till she got to 15, and she said 15. And we were young enough, so we just got hysterical when she said, and after that she would never speak. And
Well, now, Mrs. Howard, did you say you still count in Swiss? Or?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I know. I haven't counted for quite a few years, so maybe I can't. I think it's 8, 20, 30, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 7. Elgin, 12, and I guess I'm lost.
what is 13?
Then I get into the Norwegian, which is red.
Dr. Barney. Remember it, don't you, Paul?
Funny stuff.
Yeah.
Now, what I don't know about Dr.
Margaret Stewart.
How about Dr. Hatch?
Halo.
Huh?
Halo.
Yeah.
Oh, nothing.
Well, now, what were some of the things that either this Dr. Farney or that your family practiced that would be different than healthcare today?
I didn't know about that.
Well, don't find it out.
I always thought it was a laxative. I think that's right.
How does that?
Was it a laxative?
What's this?
What are you talking about?
Funny stuff.
Oh, I don't know.
No, it was.
Cure all or what was it?
Well, when you had a stomachache, it just took care of it, that's all. Actually, it took care of pretty much anything you had.
Well, now, what about in your own family? Was there any kind of plants or herbs? Or, well, Mrs. Howard, you said you had some
Well,
ideas.
my grandmother lived with us every time I got sick with something, where she came up with something out of the woods. Like, well, one was chamomile, which of course comes in the garden. I made lots of that. And then there's something called shop garden, I don't know what that was.
Sharp rubber, no, it's hero.
Well, anyway, when she came with that, I always got better before she got.
I feel like Campbell.
Where was that?
Yeah, that was shop garden stuff was. And I don't remember what that was supposed to cure, but, I just don't remember.
Did you have any particular kind of home front vet medicine that you practiced that people just aren't doing anymore today?
Well, I tell you, you talk about mastitis and cattle. Back in those days, we called it jargon. At that time, when they used lard and kerosene mixed together, wasn't it?
Or a little fat off of a skunk, you can see.
Well, that, we mentioned that last week about skunk oil,
Yeah.
and that was
Take that fat and rub it on a, you know. Yeah.
Whose job was it to go get the skunk?
Yeah.
Did you ever see a skunk? Did you ever-
No.
Well,
I got my share.
you know, the skin of skunk was a hard thing to do because it had so much fat hanging.
Yeah, that's right.
And when you put out already skin of skunk, and you know, like a fox or a squirrel or a rabbit or anything, or a skunk, that always had a layer of fat.
Was there any sort of lore about what makes things grow? That, nowadays you just follow the directions on the seed packet, and I'm not sure that's always quite the entire story.
You have to plant potatoes on Good Friday.
Plant potatoes on Good Friday, no matter when it falls, since it's okay.
And I also know my grandmother's garden was always just immaculate. And she always had us, we had to walk around, I think it was kerosene in the can. We had to pick off the potato bugs off the potato plants.
I've got to tell you that Alma and I are sisters, so.
So when one of you tells something about the family, why, you tell it for both of you.
I guess our grandmother, I don't remember learning the language, but I guess we lived with our grandmother when we were little, and I don't remember that.
She got married then the second time and I left, and I think I was with her longer. I was ahead of you.
Do you think that generational difference played out in a lot of families that say an older sibling would, the reason I ask is this, I've seen cases where in a family, the older siblings know more because they're older and they're closer to the time that their parents maybe were immigrants or that their parents were monolingual. But then I've also seen cases where, let's say, the last child, who's the last one out, maybe spends a lot of time taking care of mom and dad or taking care of a grandparent, and sometimes it's exactly the youngest child, who speaks the other language the most. I'm just wondering what some of the patterns were in your families.
Well, like she was raised with my mother. My mother was my youngest daughter, and most of the time she's lived with us, and that's why we had so much contact with her.
I was talking to my mother in Swiss because on the telephone we talked Swiss, and I don't know why we did, because we weren't talking Swiss otherwise. But it seemed like when we talked on the telephone until she died, when we talked Swiss so much.
Well, remember that party line, a lot of that way people could listen in.
Although if they also spoke Swiss, then wouldn't the party line be a great source of news? If there were other people on the line that understood the language, wouldn't the party line be a marvelous source of news?
Still was. At one time we had 21 rings on our county the party line.
When one ring went, all the receivers went off.
I was caught listening to the phone because there were two Swiss ladies talking, and they were gossiping, and I was listening. And so they kept talking about many people, and finally, one of them was my aunt. She said, the other lady said, well, do you suppose there's anybody in the line that understands this? And she said, I know somebody. Alice Howard, I bet you she understands it. Are you there, Alice?
Was there anything about that period back then that you are just as glad that it's passed? I mean, wonderful as it was, probably there are some things that you're just as glad to see have been have changed over time, or maybe not.
Paul's uncle there, he had a feed grinder. He would grind the feed for the neighbors around him. Once a week, one long ring. Gonna grind feed, bring your grist over this afternoon if you want it ground. So everybody was on the line, so you didn't need to worry.
I talked to Phil last week about that. Do you remember yet when the Shore brothers, the ring would go a long ring? I think it was on Monday. Shore brothers would take in Bill Cam tomorrow.
Yeah.
And another long ring to put on the lookout, they had a fire something.
Well, now let me skate out onto some thin ice with the question. sometimes correctly and sometimes incorrectly, we tend to have, excuse me. I'm sure I'm not allergic to Swiss people. Sometimes certain groups develop a certain stereotype about them. And sometimes there's a basis of fact to it. What do you think was the, I'm sorry. I'll edit that out of the tape. What do you think was the picture either that other people had of you or that you had of yourselves? What would be the 4 or 5 words that either you or other people would have used to describe Swiss people?
Dutch. They call them Dutch. All right, now, let's get this straight, you're down where the church used to be, it's got to be called the Dutch Bottom. And now, who's pregnant out here? Oh, George isn't here. He just told me the reason for that was it used to be Dutch Bottom. And then when the Germans, during World War I, they got changed to Dutch Bottom.
Then we got to be Dutch people.
Yeah. Now, you don't talk about the county called, they never called it, you always called it Dutch people.
Well, now, what would be 3, 4, 5 words you would use yourselves to describe the Swiss people? I'm sure they're all positive.
Yeah. To describe
Well, now,
I don't know, would it be Dolkop?
well, now, what do you think that the English on one side and the Norwegians on the other would have said about you? And I'm not looking necessarily for anything negative, but what was the image that you had of these people?
Well, I think they were called Schweitzers. And then other ones were Norskies, but I think they were all friends. I mean, there was the division in there. And I got to be 1/4 Norwegian.
Talking about Turkey River a little while ago, or a while back, and Turtle Choke is a trophy, yes, supposed to be. Norwegian gal was on the north side of the river, and the Swiss gal was on the south side of the river. So the Swiss gal supposed to have said, how do you cross? How do you get across? Or how do you get to the other side, she said. The Norwegian girl said, I am on the other side.
Well, on that happy note, does anybody else have something they want to say before we maybe take a little break for, is it juice, is it coffee, is it?
Juice and coffee and cookies.
Juice and coffee and cookies?
But something we hadn't done was introduce ourselves.
I'm sorry.
There's a young man here, I don't know, and maybe we should go around the table and just say your name and, you could even say what you think about being here.
I'm Gary Anderson. I'm Norwegian, but I don't understand most of what you're saying. I'm taking notes to eventually turn this into a one-act play. So, all your funny stories, that's the things I'm keeping.
Well, then there you go.
About Alpha Creek. I'm Romeo Steiner.
Very beautiful.
Right. Where are you from?
From Switzerland.
Who are you visiting?
I'm with Phil Weber. I'm a language assistant student at college.
Elgin, people with circles. No, no, lost time.
Paul Billy Cofer.
Marla's Klein, Alice Howard,
Elgin Shrine.
Wanda Meyer, I married a Swiss, I know nothing about them. I'm learning.
Brother Biden, both my parents are Swiss.
Ruth Shepard. My parents, my grandparents were all Swiss, but my mother grew up where they spoke German. And so when she came, Dad married her, she was from Michigan. And she, didn't know the Swiss really, but Dad talked Swiss, Mom talked German. And us kids always understood her, but we took the Swiss language. We didn't take her language. One day, a neighbor boy came down, and my mother and my aunt that lived with us gave him a piece of pie. He got home, his mother said, "Who gave you the pie? Was it Sarah or Aunt Lena?" He said, "It's the one that talks so Norwegian."
Now, she was high German, wasn't she?
Huh?
She was high German.
Well, more High German.
Yeah, high German.
Then, of course, she got it pretty well mixed up with the
Yeah.
Swiss then after she lived here. But the kids had a little trouble understanding her. She talks with German.
I talked to an old lady here quite a few years ago, and she was low German. I could not understand one word.
No, I won't.
No, it's just that much different.
Grandchildren to know about the experiences you made. This is what you'd like to tell them. Sounds like this is a great way to kill a conversation.
We were talking about eating at the church. Well, that's one thing, we go to church once in a while with my grandmother down at Elgin. And the thing I remember that at lunchtime, you always got a slice of plain white bread with milk and sugar on it. But I thought that was the greatest treat in the world.
But I seem to make it to the kitchen in the middle.
And we also used to fight for the crust.
And then the beef golfers would sure like.
I said that the townspeople wanted to help build the present Methodist Church. But actually, in 1850, I believe it was, or 1852, we already had a pioneer Methodist preacher in Elgin, and they went through a period of small churches. And I don't know, what the language was spoken in those at that time, but there actually has been a Methodist church in the community since 1850 or 52. But the church that is presently there now was built.
That same building.
Yes, by
Very beautiful structure.
by the town people, one of the English-speaking larger church, community church.
When they wanted an English church, you mentioned earlier that they felt the war was coming on. I can imagine different reasons they'd want an English church. One might be because of the war and that atmosphere, or it might be that they felt that they could reach certain groups better. Outsiders who moved in, or their children as they're going to school. I can imagine they might want an English church just because, even though there were a lot of German-speaking Methodists in Iowa, it's out of the English tradition. What is your sense of why they wanted an English church?
Well, like I said, according to my history that I found out this summer, the town people I think they wanted to get away from a German-speaking atmosphere. And so a lot of the town people wanted I should call it maybe a community church, but a lot of the people who weren't Methodist helped to build the church at the time. But I think probably the influence of the war was probably one of the reasons.
Carrie, I'm going to skate out on the thin ice now again. I'm going to kind of put you on the spot, but they say that you can take it. If I put you on the spot. They do.
Oh, they did, yeah. Now, Now, who is they?
Well, they say that you're really quite a good storyteller.
Is that right?
And I haven't heard a good story for a while.
You say you haven't, huh? Heard a good one?
Not for a while. You know, I've got almost 200 miles to drive back home. I mean, I'll have good companionship with Romeo, but still.
Well, I suppose I could,
You're telling us what?
is it Swiss or English? English?
Well, Swiss would be nice.
Well, then, a lot of them wouldn't understand it, would they?
Well, they say that they also say that you're talented and can do both, sometimes almost simultaneously.
I suppose I could tell you how I met my wife, maybe.
They don't care, they all know. I don't know. You don't want to hear it.
Her dad hired me to work for him, see? And so then I was working and there, and then out in the field didn't bother, but at home doing chores, then pretty soon I noticed she was following me around all the time. So I walked a little faster and she walked faster. Oh, pretty soon I run and she run. And there was no getting away, so I just stopped. So anyway, I went to see her a couple of times, or 2 or 3 times, and I kind of laid off, you know.
We hear her version.
Yeah, right.
Well, the neighbor boy said, do you know of any young girls around who kind of go and visit them like on a Saturday evening, you know, stuff? Oh, I said, there's some around, but then our neighborhood, I said, it's all viticulture, so that leaves me out. He had a different name, you know, so. Okay, then I took care of that. Pretty soon he said, and then I just went to Elgin the other day and I went to buy Ben Demler's. Now that's the place. And he said, I noticed things was blossoming out pretty nice up there. Boy, I'll tell you, I got right in the dial system and made a gate for the right in no time at all before he was going to take over, you know. Well, then I had an old car and here the door on the passenger side was wore out and the hinges was bad and you just had to leave it in the lock, otherwise you have the door, you know. So anyway, when I called her about the day, she would just take her pick, you know, without calling. So I got up there and I walked out. I was just so nervous, you know, being us gonna get to take her along, you know. Forgot about that door. I thought I'd just slide her into the driver's side, you know, there, and she'd want to sit in the middle of the seat anyway. Here I forgot all about it, and I went around the other side, opened the door, and had her right in my arms. The door. That went over big. That's the end of the story.
This has nothing to do with Swiss, does it?
Ron, do you have anything to add to this story?
Nothing except every family get together. He's got brothers here, you know. They have to ask, well, how did this go now? And they've never heard it before, and they've heard it thousands of times. So we have to think of a new story sometimes.
Well, now, what would be a good story to tell me in Swiss that I haven't heard?
That might take too long.
Well, I guess probably I'd have to, the other brother, he was here the other time when we was at home.
Are you going to tell them in Swiss?
Yeah.
You're supposed to tell them in Swiss.
So she En det går pløke, ikke det brød, det går pløke, med sånne lovpløk. Stryras kan stranden. Det gjelder stryras. Andre måtte si et evterkanne, et stat, med mer oss, og det spåg. Og det fattade det är en skitman. Då är det brödet sett där och sidor rakt av inom posten och hänger det både vid det. Att med sitt liv ur gamla. Då är det hänger. Svävårdar vi ju blå. Så må där efter det döda har efter det fatta graff i gången. För att det död. Är det gott? Så smakar det. Ja, roepen ik zei, ja, die heeft Portugie, we God heeft het afgemaakt. Daar had hij het me gezegd is ook. Dus, hoe gewoon, hebben we iets gehad. De vraag wordt de wie, ja, wordt de wie. We hadden het heeft u gehad bij de deur gezet, en we zeggen dat we allemaal van de overen. Alle vingers kijken. Och då är det stopp och hem hänger an. Ja, det är förlora för att det var efter mig. Ja, efter det sätt så vi då fick han efter det sätt letar det läser. A smile, vi säger det där. Klick, a smile. Så det vet. Efter det sätt är han minst klick du efter hit. Du har det du klick det dit hälften med hela. Ja, det är praktiskt. Wat er gezegd wordt, terugzien, brengt de aan met de houten, brengt de strak uit, het samen, twee doppelt maakt, en daar met dat gespeurd te heen. Er staat het oud verstanden? Ja. Oh, hè?
Everybody else probably too.
Ja.
You'll have to translate now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if this records in Swiss or not.
I don't think Gary is taking notes in Swiss.
That story in the REC paper next time.
Is one the facet of the Swiss culture that we haven't spoken about, and that was winemaking. And my father and his brothers, they all made pretty good wine. And the wine season started when the dandelions were in bloom, we made dandelion wine. Later on, as that honestly back up a little bit, well, I'll keep on. Then they made cherry wine, and they had grape wine, and then an elderberry blossom wine, and the elderberry wine. But I like the dandelion wine the best. But when it was still fermenting, they put it in jugs with a narrow neck, and they would put the lemon rind or lemon slices in, and sugar, and let it ferment. And those bottles or jugs, they would ferment and all the impurities would come off the top. And us, my sister and we go and drink that and lick that off and see what the deal was every day, how many days, for all that stuff that come off the top that had water to it. So then eventually it was bothered. And the cherry, at that time, everybody had cherry trees in the place. Everybody had cherry trees. And then I remember Dan and I would go along the road and big elderberry blossoms. He was a big one of that. And then the thing that I remember about the best, on Labor Day we didn't have soup. So we went down to my uncle's place and we went to gather wild black cherries. And it was really quite a job. I mean, those trees were very big. In fact, they would clear up from the trees sometimes, they cut the limb down so we could strip the manicure. But they shook them down up. They had sheets and everything, and they used that for wine. They made wine of that. I remember this year I never saw. And I remember my dad, he was very frugal. When they had company, he did his job. Go down and get a pint jar of wine. And ministers, and we even served it the same. My dad would come out, and everybody, I mean, they wanted, I remember real well. They always had cheese, and my mother always had a certain kind of bars he served at. And I get to talk about a story. He would try old Al soup. You know, they give him some wine, and somebody told him, well, that's 7 or 8 years old. I mean, my dad used to have it that way too. And he hold up the glass, and it was a small glass. He said, sure small for his age.
Leave it out.
He said in the Swiss, of course, in Swiss, leave the salt, yeah.
A little deal about talking about wine and deals. I guess I heard in Switzerland they said something like this. Is a Schweiz heeft die grote wheat. Van dit beste zie. Je werd die hartig lief, dat je nog lekker lustig ziet.
Wine's no better anywhere than in Switzerland. Wine's in the heart.
When you're talking about dandelion wine, when we stayed with my grandmother, on the days that it was below zero, and I don't think we ever had wine at home or tasted anything, but on the days that it was below zero, she always gave us a little glass of dandelion wine before we started school, so we wouldn't freeze to death. Sometimes we were pretty happy with that.
Well, now, last week I read you some passages from that book about the Germanic colonies, and there were some people there that got some gentle ribbing, or maybe not so very gentle ribbing, because they liked their wine or their beer just pretty much. Was that at all a problem here, or were all of you Swiss pretty temperate? And
I don't think that,
They never got drunk.
No.
That's what they just, no.
But even now, they still always have wine at their tables, don't they?
I know when I'm still at home yet, of course I was in grade school, the men in the neighborhood would meet, and they play yas, which is a Swiss. Found out when I got over to Switzerland, they were still playing yas over there. And I know it's something like Virginia, it must be quite, nobody had said anything when he was playing. They were very serious, except when they were chopping and whatever. And they always had their wine over there, because everybody made wine, and so either had grape wine or whatever, and they were always checking each other's wine, to see. I think it was a matter of pride about having wine. And so when I was over in Switzerland, they told me that we didn't have wine over here like they do there, because they don't put a lot of sugar in their wine. It's natural sugar. And so I know they served wine at the meals, and there's a goblet, and there's quite a little in there. And I said, well, I don't know about me. I'm used to that. And they said, oh, you just drink that, that's good for you. And so we had it every noon, and I could always feel my nose getting hot.
Hey, I'm going to switch gears to quite a different subject, but something that I saw last week and that I think really ought to get on the tape. Do we have a member of the Meyer family here? Could somebody go and lift that big bell?
I've never like that.
And tell a little of the story about how that bell came to be.
Now, these are the people where I stayed. They're called the Burkholders, and that was my mother's cousin. And she had 10 children, or she has 10 children, of course she's gone now. But after I came home, and we sort of got to know each other, hear about each other, then we have a family reunion every year. And we had a 100-year reunion. And they came over, some of them came over and they brought this bell for us.
It says July 1985, in memory of the Meyer reunion. And here it says greetings from the Swiss relatives.
But they chased the cattle up in the mountains, they even put cocaine on there.
Yeah.
Flowers here, flowers, and they strap them to the horns, you know.
But you know, a lot of that's dying out too, you know, years ago, make the cheese up in the mountains, you know, and not anymore. They got, I said, I believe they got 7,000 miles of stainless steel pipes running down the mountains, and they make the cheese down in the valley, you know.
And they actually use that bell?
What?
For ceremonies. This is when they have the special fairs,
Yeah.
bringing the cattle on the, we just happened to be there, and just take out the mountains, so we can get these cattle down, and then they had flowers that put in there.
I have friends that just came back from Switzerland, and this is what she told me about, was the cattle with the bells and the flowers, and what a ceremony it was. So evidently on occasion for tourists, they will still do it.
And you have to stop once in a while because the cattle are in the road, and we get through.
I'd like to hear about the flowers, because that's one of my best memories of my grandma Hanson. She had flowers everywhere, and I remember one, actually it was a long path back to the outhouse, but along the fence she had just a thick bed of all kinds of flowers, pinks, and flowers must have been important to the Swiss, and probably is over there too, because everything you get from Switzerland, you see flowers.
They're so beautiful over there, so. You come in the door and you see the little gate and you think they came out of the greenhouse, and they didn't.
But what kind of flowers did you plant years ago? I'd like to know what some of those were, and I'll bet all of you had the same kind of flowers.
Well, Astor was one.
Asters?
Astor, they call it Astor. And let's see, Rose.
And dahlias.
And Dahlia.
Pansies and geraniums.
Pansies, and now, especially in some of these big resort places, and lilies. I never saw flowers, and also in the ceremony, and that's impatience. They even have them up in the second story, and in order to water them, they stood down in the first story, and they pumped water up with a hose, and watered them up in the balcony in the second floor.
Ruth, what kind of flowers did you like to plant?
What?
Outside, what kind of flowers?
Well,
Yeah, or any time.
well, I know I love salvias always.
The red.
Yeah, red salvias.
And geranium.
And geraniums, yeah.
Oh, that's a big flower. I know that.
I asked them what they did with them in the winter, you know, because all the windows were hanging with geraniums. And they said, oh, we just throw them away, and we start out fresh next year.
The first time we were in Switzerland and at my father's cousin's house, we were sitting in the kitchen. All of a sudden I looked up and there were just rows of smoked meat, bologna and things hanging up in the kitchen ceiling, and that's where they smoked their meat at that time.
There was a little recess right above the stove. A little recess up in the ceiling is about 4 feet up in the ceiling, pretty near the width of the room. And your stove was right underneath, and when they would put wood in the stove, they'd leave the lid off. You know, first the wood when it starts makes a lot of smoke. And that would go right up in there and smoke the meat.
And it was invented in such a way it would go through the meat rather than into the house.
Yeah.
You never smelled smoke in the house or in the kitchen either.
Just settled up in there, and then they do just try to cover it, you know, with that thing would be full of smoke up there, not no smoke in the house.
Good quilters here.
Who are some of the big quilters? We're not putting you on the spot, are
I
we?
have a quilt up right now, a real big one.
Well, now, when people here do quilting, do they primarily do patchwork quilting, or is it more stitchwork design quilting?
This one has been embroidered
Oh, embroidery.
embroidered block, and then they put it together with colored prints to go with the embroidered.
That's a lot of work.
Yes, I didn't put it together, I just put them up and stitched it through quilting along with help.
Many years ago. And I know it right away, I saw they wasn't just too done in Switzerland because this thing here does the holes to plant potatoes and this is the cultivator. So that's the history of that thing.
You talk Swiss?
Sweet.
Did you try that machine out, Harry?
A draw knife and old Schweitzer made. And I think it's Gottfried Frederick.
What is it slice?
What?
What does it slice?
Wood. Wood, yeah. Oh, you saw the American draw knives, didn't you? Oh, this was made in America by the old guy that learned his woodworking, made it. He comes from Switzerland, yeah.
Vic?
Yeah. Okay, this here, once in a while, over the couple of weeks, the Norwegians got in a little bit once in a while. See, we got one down here. I know he's a pretty big man, I don't know. I told him I could take it, though. Well, anyway, you used to get some Norwegian jokes. So I had a guy in Claremont that I always, when I got one, I would make even a special trip to pull it on him, see? So finally, I guess he did have enough, and so one time when I come with the intention of pulling one on him again, he handed me this thing here. So what in the world is that? And I studied and studied, let me study a long time. I said, no, I cannot come up with what that. He said, that is a Swiss chainsaw, he said.
Okay, go ahead.
Als ik een komau ga, schoenen steekt im draad. Als stelt zich gebelucht ziet daar, omkonkelt met de nacht. En wij is een goede verhoogd. Mijn naam dan moet alleen haar. De broer met de nummer gaat smuigen, en nummer zal vroeger hoesten.
My folks were Swiss, but they never taught Swiss when I was growing up. And the first book I got when I went to Sunday school was this here. And I have no idea whether it's religion or teaching the German language. And that's all I remember about it. I did learn A, B, C, D. I guess that's as far as I got. Esther Brasher. So I really didn't learn very few things in Sunday school because of the language. My classmates sitting around here, they knew how to talk.
This has something to do with language. And I was in Battle visiting my relatives. And before I went home, I wanted to bring something home to my children. And they had a book in history there that makes bells for cows. And so I stopped in one day, and my Swiss is pretty fractured. And so he couldn't talk English either. So I said, I wondered if he could make some glockens for my kinder. So he kind of smiled, he said yes, that he could. And I wanted some cleaning ones, not cleaning, is that how we say them?
Small.
Small ones. And he said I should come back in a couple of days and have some fun. I wanted 5 of them. And they cost, I think they were $5 a piece, which I thought was wonderful. And so I went back in 2 days and they were finishing them up. And of course it's got the cross on it. And his wife, they were a young couple, and she was on a wheel and she was making this shiny stuff around it. And so I thought it was just really something to think I was here in Switzerland and I didn't tell me, I couldn't believe it, you know. And so many things when I was over there, I just could hardly believe that I was here, which is a long story.
We got from Ernlark, from Switzerland.
So what now?
Cowbells.
Oh.
Cowbells, yeah.
Oh,
That they used to, and I don't know what happened to them. They're hanging in the shop, and I went to look for them, and they wasn't there, so I don't know.
somebody who's out.
Yeah, probably. Oh, then nobody would take that. It'd have to be, it would have been a Swiss. It had to been too small. He'd have wanted something bigger.
Yeah, right.
You know, there's only two types of people, you know that.
No, tell me.
The Swiss and them they wish they were.
New Year's, and there was someone that would come to your door dressed in white, and they were called like a mutti. We call it a mutti. Now, I don't know if this word came from mother.
No, you're mutti. No, you're mutti.
Yeah.
Really?
I mean, may on mutti, they say a mutti. May on mutti.
Oh.
But is a New Year woman.
Well, well, in our family, my mother's family, they used to, the children on New Year's Eve, after they had cleared the supper, the table and had finished their dishes, then they would reset the table, and the children would gather around the table again and sit and wait by their plate for this person to come in. And they didn't bring toys, they brought things more like fruit and nuts and this type of thing. So in later years, my mother used to always fix little paper sacks filled with things that my children and grandchildren liked. And she'd make homemade fudge and popcorn balls and this type of thing. So those were always our mutti bags, and we used those at Christmas. Well, after my mother died, I kept thinking about this custom and wanting to continue with this Swiss custom. So I talked to my husband one time, and I said, let's surprise our grandkids. And I said, would you be the mutti? Well, he's American. I told him he had to dress in white, so I laid out a white shirt, and he had kind of a white pair of pants. And so I had the children, we set the table again, had them all sitting around the table. And when he came out of the bedroom, he was really a modern day mutti. He had put on a white baseball cap backwards, and dark sunglasses. And we always had things like in a pillowcase, like a white case, and I had packages and gifts in there. So he came out to the table, and here he is with our grandchildren. And of course, they just went into hysterics. And the youngest one looked at me, and finally she said, "Oh, he was walking with a cane," and he was really playing the part. And so our youngest one said, looked at me, and she said, "That really is Grandma, isn't it?" She said. So I wondered if the rest of you, did you ever have something like this? What was word that you said, George? What does that mean?
A New Year, did you
Yeah,
New Year's?
yeah.
Yeah, New Year's mutti. I don't know.
Nothing. We pronounce it, yeah.
Yeah.
Don't you remember that? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, you also mutti, is that right? That's the way.
Did you have candy and nuts? Was it the same type of thing that I'm telling you?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's just the way it is. Yeah, it's just the way it is.
Well, a lot of people haven't heard of this, and I just wondered.
Yeah.
You listen to
Mutti,
it.
yeah. I probably
What our family did, and that was Fred Hansen. I used to go back to my great aunt Ida Myers, and we would sit on the porch swing at night on where Gary lives down in that porch swing. We'd look off toward those steep hills, and he would tell about blurry, I call it blurry, I can't get this guttural sound like this, and that would come down out of the Swiss Alps, he'd tell us, and get, naughty children. And so I was sitting on that porch swing, I could almost visualize coming out of the hillside over there. And then he would draw a picture of it, and I have written a book called Treasured Memory that I put all the Swiss customs that I can remember that my family told. And Elmer Meyer, bless his heart, drew a blaurie, and it has a triangular face, long body, and a long curly tail. Did any of you ever hear about such an animal that was like in the Alps or?
When did it come out of the hills or what?
Well, if the children were naughty.
Oh, this is the vehicle for crest. And each family in Switzerland had a crest made like this, and it meant, well, the viticultors were farmers, seniors, or worked on the land. And then the diddlers were woodworkers. My great-grandfather was he made ropes for those Swiss homes over there. That was his main occupation.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, it is, except mine is not as good a shape as his. This is my father's.
You probably learned.
No, it wasn't mine.
About what year would you say that, through what year might a Sunday school pupil have had a book like that?
The date on this book is 1926 is the date on this book that I own. I think they had Harry's mom was a German teacher. What did she teach? Just a month in the summertime, or how? I'm not
I
sure.
don't remember, probably Ruth knows. My mother taught German in the school.
Yeah, it was when the other school year was over with.
Yeah.
She taught penmanship, music, and what else?
Now that was up where the brick school was, but it was an older building, wasn't it?
Yeah,
the brick school
down,
wasn't built yet.
Yeah. And then they'd have to write little letters. I have the book that my dad had, but I don't know where it's at. And then they had to write little letters, and so they were writing to somebody. So he wrote, "Dear Fräulein," I have to say it in English, that he didn't really know much to write it because when he wrote so often, there wasn't much to write. Write it to a girl.
I'll bring it.
Now Ruth, correct me if I'm wrong, but my mother always said that on this German school, they held that in that house over on the Wiedekofer land. Remember, there used to be a house up there, right from the Orange Wiedekofers down the creek and then up on the hill.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's maybe
that
where
was in my mind, but I don't know how right I am.
Well, see, when the other one burned down, maybe they had.
Okay, I think that rings a bell, yeah.
And what have we got?
This is my grandfather, and my grandfather was Gottlieb Denler. This is his report card when he was going to school. And maybe you'll have to correct me on some of this. I think this is like his birth certificate. And I'm not sure when he came here, but at the age of 22, he became a naturalized citizen of the United States. Can you tell me what this is? Switzerland now, from my mother's cousin. He uses the English letters where the old-time Swiss used letters that we couldn't read. So we're able to read these and look up some words in a dictionary I have, and we're able to read his letters. But he writes in German, and when
Ruth there can read them, I'm sure.
Yeah, but I can't pronounce it the way they should.
well, we don't have to read it. But then when I write to them, I use the typewriter, but I write English because I cannot write Swiss. In 72, we went to Switzerland and visited my father's cousin. He was running a home for the elderly people, and those people were making this material and making aprons, and he gave this to me, and I've been really appreciating it.
See, what is it?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, it is.
Oh, yeah.
See, it has this lid here.
Swiss costume. I remember when people around you, they always wore aprons.
And that was the material they were making the material and they were sewing this. They also had their own bakery. They were making bread. I'll just leave it there. It's a commemorative coin from Switzerland brought to me by my dad's cousin. And I really don't know, it was money that they quit using. And so he bought this in this case and brought it to me.
Maybe that's gold.
Well, I don't know.
And I didn't have any apples, otherwise I'd one on.
Now, was this one that they brought over or that they crafted in this country?
That I don't know, but as long as I can remember, they used to dry so many apples. That's another thing, the Swiss ate a lot of dried apples. And the folks, or, the grandparents, people would bring them by the washtub stove. That's the brassily iron, see, that was for, when they had stoves with, they took off the lid, then that would fit, then you turn it.
It makes little round things like a cookie.
It's got designs on it.
Remember.
See?
You remember them like the bread, huh? Do you remember them? Oh, absolutely. You discuss that a little bit.
Snowblats, we call it we say they were clearly, but then you have to fry them and eat. But they'd take them on the
knees and flatten them out.
They'd roll it out as thin as they could, and then they'd take it over their knees and stretch it as good as they could.
And they put a frying butter, and it curled up and blistered in it.
Yeah, blistery.
Yeah.
But then my folks usually made a kind of a roll and fried them. They didn't make them flats. But it's the same dough.
Yeah.
It's egg yolks and water and here's a recipe. Oh, flats, 3 eggs, pinch this off. Beat hard. Add 1 cup of milk and butter size of 1/2 egg. Beat hard again. Make a stiff dough. Making the patties and let set for 1 hour. Roll out thin, then stretch with the hands. Fry in hot flour and sprinkle with sugar.
I have a friend, Margaret Solberger, and we were pals since we were little, and she went to Switzerland and came back. And they always made bracelets, and they had an iron like that, and they would give me some every year. And so when I went to Switzerland, and I was with this family, we made bracelets together before I went home. And they're just really a delicate. They taste so good. And I told Margaret, I said, I'm going to get one of those machines. You see, they're electric now. And so she said, I don't think you want to get them. They're really expensive, and you're only going to make them once a year at Christmas time.
Marisha Buck had it, and then she gave it to me. So
I have it.
you had it, and you gave me 2 or 3 of the old quilts. But it's a lot of that is flour sacks and things like that it was quilted with. They didn't have the pretty material that we have nowadays. This one I made a few years ago, and I'll never make another one of them because each block has 29 pieces in it. So, and I used pink on the back so they wouldn't see my stitching quite as easy. This week, a couple of days. This is made out of polyester. You don't wear polyester out too good. And it's the style of the way I put it together that I like.
What's that?
Now, this one was Grandma Pulver's, you say?
That one, yeah, that's the one that's the one Trudy has it.
Oh, I see. Who made that, you know?
I don't know.
Kind of a crazy pattern, you know.
The one I know.
About influenza and things of that sort.
Well, this was Hilda Meyer, and she's my first cousin. And she lost her mother and father and uncle. And the one aunt lived. And they all lived on a farm together. They farmed together, and they had a big square house there. And Hilda tells of her, remembering her mother dying. And she was singing, Jesus loves me, she said, when she died. And she was just a very little girl then, but she remembers that. And so all the relatives got together, we all got together, and we farmed. Like I say,
Well, now that you go.
family took the children. Some children went she went to the aunt that was left behind. And, because she was expecting a baby and she left. But her mother just had a baby, and anybody that had a baby at that time did not make it. And it was a very terrible thing.
My mother's mother died at our home, and I can remember, and I can't tell you now what year it was, but my mother's brothers and sisters all lived around in the Des Moines area, and they all came after she had passed away, and the services were at our house. And at that time, we were, I don't know how old, there were about 8 of us cousins, all kind of within 5 years age. And when the services were held in our big kitchen dining room, my grandfather made us children go upstairs because he thought that was no place for kids to be while the services were on. So we had a stovepipe going up through, and all of us laid around here and laid our ears down and looked down through there to see what was going on while the services were held. And after she was buried in Tennessee with her husband, my grandfather, the body was loaded on a train, and 2 of my uncles went with the body to Homewell, Tennessee. And I think there was one of the apostolic ministers had the services, but I don't remember who. That's something I'll never forget.
What time of the year was that?
I can't tell you that either. I know it was cold weather.
So they didn't have to pack the body with ice or anything?
See, that I don't remember what they did with the body.
Mm-hmm.
And how long it took for them to get there, I don't know that either.
Mm-hmm.
But it's something that I'll never forget.
Mm-hmm.
And when my cousins and I get together, when we always talk about laying around that stovepipe, we really showed my grandfather that we could do what he thought we couldn't do.
Yeah. My grandmother Hanson, she was a bum gardener, and they called my dad to come up right away. And my grandmother fell with a stroke. And I just remember, I wasn't very old, but I remember they had her laid out on the couch, and I'm not too sure what she was laid out on. But Aunt Ellen just didn't believe that she was gone. And the undertaker was there. And he said, yeah, she said she was gone. He thought she was still, warm death and under, her feeling of her neck. And I just think that was so vivid to me. That was the first death that any experience being around. I don't know how old I was. Maybe I was 8. And she was, I don't remember her funeral in the home, but it had to be in the home because most of them were. And she was buried down the Apostolic cemetery. And then my other grandmother was living with us, and she died in the night. And then I was, of course, didn't know about it until after the when she was downstairs in the bedroom. And I remember they did have their funerals in the houses then. And I know my house, and I think a lot of people's houses have wide doorways. And that's why they were built that way, so they could get the coffins on through.
And George to the roof then. There wasn't many babies born down the bottom that she didn't help deliver.
That's what I said about.
In our generation,
Lena,
that just about took them all in. She was just about every place.
Could you tell us a little about what a midwife did in those days?
You know what she did? What she did in those days to
I know she said the hardest place she ever went was up to your post. She had to work the hardest there. Garden and bake and take care of the baby, and then the little ones.
Yeah.
All I think was in bad shape.
Yeah.
Weren't you kind of a invalid or something?
Yeah.
Were you an invalid?
Well, I mean, he holds.
Yeah, polio.
Yeah. Well, there was after all, there was 10 in the family.
Yeah.
We had to work for,
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, she.
That's why Harry thinks there's only vehicle for C.
Now, this got to be a Swiss too much.
They think I should tell a story in Swiss. about the Billy Copers, well, about Harry at least. But I don't know if I can do it or not, but I'll try. Enigste Mary Douglas för den för Woche und sind wir darüber nachgeblieben und es sind Leute für die Schweiz. So, der Harry hat auch gern Schweizer. Und so hat er gesagt, jetzt wollen wir in Nacht laufen. Und dann können wir kijkt met de vielleicht over voor de Schweiz. Zo zijn we gelaufen, das haben wir gerade ein Lied really und da kommt der Mann eine Frau und hat er gesagt, oh, ich glaube, die Lieder sind von der Schweiz, jetzt wollen wir mit denen reden. So ist er halt gegangen und hat angefangen, jede Bitte kommen, hat er gesagt. Sehr stimmt. Sie hat nicht gedacht von dem.
An het nu geld.
So hat er geredet und geredet und geredet und er hat angefangen, Mund hat gehalten für eine Minute, halbe Minute vielleicht. Habe ich angefangen gesagt, ich bin auch in Denver gesehen. Das war mein Name. Hat sie gesagt, oh, wir kennen viele Denver in der Schweiz. Ah, sie sind so schöne, gute Leute. Wir haben Nachbarn von der sie heißen und die sind so schön.
I come from the farm, and I told her, she said she had pains, and so I told her to put on the light or something if I wanted me to come in. And I come in, the baby was already in the way, so I helped deliver that baby. And by the time we delivered the baby, then my aunt comes. She was a regular midwife. Yeah, Aunt Lena come then. So she took care of that cord and everything. I didn't have to do that.
Well, now, what all did you expect that a midwife would do in a typical instance? How would
a midwife just took the house right over. That is, anyway, Aunt Lena did. That's the only one that I know about. She just took the house chore over. Whatever had to be done was done. Just to, if anything better than the lady in the house done it, if anything, because it just was done right. That's all there was to it. And she took the baby, took care of the baby, and she changed the diapers. She washed the clothes, and she done the cooking. The whole works. She done everything. Till the mother was able to go again. She usually would be there, what, a week?
Yeah,
a couple of weeks?
Maybe. They didn't get out of bed for how long? Years ago.
Oh,
Get out the first day.
A week.
How did they get a hold of the midwife? How did the midwife know when the baby was?
All right. When his youngest sister was born, did you go after Aunt Lena?
Yes. She was at another place, and she was at another Billy Coper. There was a Billy Coper down to Walter Billy Coper's out where Scott Fried lives now. And I had to go and get her with the horses and the buggy because the roads was impassable with the car.
So how many were there?
10, 11 years old, somewhere like that.
How many years between you and her? How many years?
But the doctor usually came.
Yeah.
Oh, sure, yeah.
At what point would the doctor show up?
What?
At what point would the doctor show up? After the work was all done, or?
Well, no, not always, not always. So sometimes the doctor got there plenty of time and then again not.
I think with Aunt Lena there, the doctor didn't even have to get there hard. I think she had to chop them many times, with the doctor.
How did she get paid?
Let's see, what did she get, $1 or $2 a day maybe?
No, I suppose something like that.
I'm sure at your place she didn't charge anything.
Maybe not.
No, I don't think so. Or at Aunt Anna's either.
No, man.
How did they learn that trade?
How did they?
Experience.
how did they, I don't know, just somebody had to do it and.
Oh, well, I don't know.
She
But I don't know.
They didn't go to college or school.
And I just want to say something about hired girls at that time. I remember my cousin, Lorraine, beautiful. She'd come to our place and help Mom a few days, once in a while, spring cleaning or whatever. And Dad was going to take her home, and so he asked her how much he owed her. And she said some figure, and of course Dad thought that was way too much, you know. And Lorena says, wage Magdalene Machanusa.
Oh, yeah. Wages went up.
What?
Wages went up.
Yeah, the wages are going up.
This guy told me that, Jake Soberger's brother, when he's here, he said, Assimilation say, man en een vrouw, say, twee schöne dochteren ka, een schwarzes haar. Nachher, een paar Jahre später, ist ein anderes Baby gesehen, und die hat Ratshaar gehabt. Und der Mann, als het een gang terug, als het gedeeld met de vader. Eindiger hat im Haus noch, hat gesagt, ist das nicht Mädchen? Bin ich der Vater zu dem Mädchen? Ja, zu dem, aber nicht für die anderen zwei. And better off that he wouldn't ask. Oh, that nice looking daughter, dark hair. And then, some years later, they had a sister, then had a daughter that had red hair. And that fellow, as that girl got a little older, that man also got to thinking that probably wasn't his daughter. She had red hair and the other was dark hair. So finally it just got pretty, drove him nuts. And he took her by the neck and she said, you tell me the truth. Is that my girl? And yeah, but the other two aren't.
Ready for a good one.
Well, I always used to hear him say, Brittany kommer Alberts Hattie, or the Brittany kommer Alberts Paul.
Well, they would say Albert's Hattie or Albert's Paul.
Yeah.
Talking about Fred Hansen, Marlins, you heard it. The Tom Blitz. Yeah. You heard it, Alvin, many times. Yeah.
Is it only in this area they said words like, they went to call them names like that they would say, Brittany kommer Alberts Bert or Al or whatever.
Well, you had the main vehicle and you had different.
Fred K. Coker was the Cubby Blitz. Yeah, Cubby Blitz.
Cubby Albert.
Huh?
Cubby Albert, Cubby Blitz. Cubby Albert, Cubby Albert was your.
Yeah. We had a wash line twice as long as this room here. And we couldn't get out of line because there was a little rope about 6-7 feet long. And the wash line had a ring on there and they tied us to the wash line so we could go back and forth along the wash line.
Play Pom-Pom Pull Away and a lot of those games.
Hand you over.
And we used to get so mad. We get so mad at George and Harry because they could run so fast. They were just like they were motorized. They did right after you. We never could catch them.
Well, now what is Andy over?
That's tossing the ball
Over the house.
If you caught it,
He partners. One
Get the
on
other
one
try
side,
to get
the
the people on the other side.
Didn't we also play a game called Shuna or something like that? Shoes? Do you remember that, George?
What?
Didn't we play a game called Shuna? Like shoes? And we'd all hide separately.
Hide and seek.
Yeah, that's what it was. Except you hid in groups.
Huh?
Except you hid in a bunch.
Shooting, yeah,
Well.
what was that shooting?
That was like hide and seek, I guess.
Huh.
What was fox and geese?
We made a big circle like a pie in the snow. In the snow, yeah.
Cut it into pieces.
And then the middle, the idea was to, that you catch them, or if they got in the middle, they were safe. Is that way it was?
I think the guy in the middle, he had to touch somebody, or catch him, whatever it was. And then that guy had to go in the middle, then they could run around this circle, or else they had paths, like cutting a pie. And they tried to get as close as they could to the guy in the middle without getting caught. Does that sound right?
Something like that.
Yeah.
Then there was steps.
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
Steps? What?
AI.
That was a real
Yeah.
popular deal. I just don't hardly remember
All
how,
right, they,
probably Alex, you probably remember just how that worked.
yeah.
Well, I know we never could, again, we could never catch Harry or George.
Well, getting back to steps, you remember how that was played. One called, one was
Oh, yeah.
got to tell them how many steps they could take. But the big joke was, say you had two poles, I mean, you walk from one fence to the other, whatever it was. And then there's one person tell you, well, you may take so many steps, but if that person didn't say, may I, he had to go start all over again.
There you go. That's right. That's come to me now.
And you still play that today?
It's called Mother May I now.
Oh,
And I play
okay.
Mother May I.
What?
They had to go dust all the doors and all the furniture on Saturdays. That was our job, the kids' job.
Uh-huh.
And
What were some of the other jobs that,
Fill the wood box.
Yeah.
Bill the wood box?
So you can
I
start
say that reminds me, you brought this up. You know, back in the old days, back out in the country church here, you know, they burned wood, and the woodshed was part of the women's toilet at the time, just the back part of it. And that was where they piled the wood in. And I remember many times my dad would split a whole box full of wood for the cook stove to where they heated the milk, you know, or the coffee. And then they brought big wood for the furnace yet. But I remember that real well. Well, I think you guys got help there too. Every once in a while on a Sunday they'd say, well, somebody should bring some wood, we're about out of it. And I remember that real well. Dad would have a box wagon full of split wood, and that's what they did do. But you guys remember that, don't you?
Oh, yes.
And I remember one time going into our corn crib, and Dad would never let anybody kill a bull snake because they kept the mice out of the corn. And I didn't like to go to the pig pantry with the cops, so I went into the corn crib where the corn cobs were nice and clean. Anyway, I picked up this big bunch of corn cobs and was going back, and I took something cold. And there was that big bull snake, and I can see that to this day.
Another thing, we always have to go and get water, carry water into the house. We had a big spring. We'd have to dip the water out and have to, that was another chore.
We'll talk about carrying water. You know, the school down there in Highlands, you know where the Highland Hall is now. You know, we never had a well there. And we at every recess, somebody, two boys, we had to carry a pail of water up to Martha Chapman's, or up there where Barbara Denner lives, or down to Yearson. And this pail was maybe I don't think it was over 10 quarts or something like that. And we went up there and carried that water hose, and that's all the water we used in church in school the whole day. And sometimes I tell you, some of that water got a little muddy, you know, Or we had grasshoppers in it or something like that. But that was, every recess and noon, or in forenoon recess, somebody two people had to go up there and get that pail of water.
Paul, you remember this?
And I remember, and also thrashing time, we had the 10-gallon pail of water, and everybody drank out of the same dipper. Nobody worried about anything, you know. I think we were more immune to bugs than we ever were nowadays.
Taught in school, we'd have to go up along the creek, and they just had a little path up along the bank and up to a spring there. And we'd have to go and get a pail of water too. And this one time,
You done that, Mark.
yeah, so our school was just real small. This room would be mighty huge. Probably a third as big as this room. Well, Billy Miningham, him and I had to go and get the pail of water one time. We started up the path there, and here he reaches in his pocket and pulls out a cigarette that he swiped from his dad the night before. So he lit her up, you know, and I said something to him. I said, "Oh, you can't do that," or something. "Oh, yeah," he said. So we spoke to him going up and back. We come back with our pail of water into that little confined room, you know, and the teacher right in. His sister was the teacher. And she said, "Who's been smoking?" Of course, nobody said anything, but I guess that night then they found out.
That reminds me of Reuben Metzger, George. He, that old plug tobacco, he chewed a little of that stuff and Ed got suspicious a little bit.
I'm talking once.
Bill. And, so Ed kind of suspicious that he had tobacco in his mouth. So Ed, he walked up to him and said, "Mach spool of Reuben." And Reuben said, "Then a great big wad went down my
He swallowed it quick.
Yeah, I did. He had that big wad.
Another one of the chores that we used to do after school is we had these hand corn shellers, and you were always expected to run through some of these corn for the chickens. And one year we must have had an early frost because quite a bit of the corn got moldy, you know, ear corn. And you had to be very careful. I know how hard it was that one year to find good corn to run through that corn sheller. If you didn't dare get chickens moldy corn, you'd die.
I gotta tell you a little about admonishment here. At home, when we had admonishment coming, and I was here and Dad was over there, we have to go over there and get it. Now today, if that turned out like that, you couldn't catch the young guys on a motorcycle.
I imagine everybody, a lot of you remember these experiences, but we had cast iron stoves at that time, where we were working coal, and on the end there was a reservoir, and this was with the carrying water thing. And so our sink had a pitcher pump, and so it was we took turns filling the reservoir every night. That had to be filled. That was a wonderful thing because the water was hot in there. And so that was one of the chores I think we always see that we took turns, you know. They didn't do too much, so we didn't see that we did too much of it, you know. That's where you had to have the wood for the stove too. That wood had to be carried in the wood box for the stove. And we gathered eggs, and of course the stove had an oven on it too, and we could open up that oven, and if we had little chickens or something that were got cold, like we put them in a box and set them on the oven door and warm them up and take them back out again. And there's a lot of things we did with this oven door in the back to get warmer heat on it too. Very cold. So there's a lot of memories with the stove.
I was working for Doc Wolves, and one night for supper, I didn't know what to fix. Mrs. Wolf wasn't home. So I thought, well, I'll make knöpfli. So Doc, I didn't know how that would go. And then Doc was eating it, and he says, whatever you call this, it's good. And I said, well, they're knöpfli, which means buttons.
Yeah, that's right.
Anyway, I didn't know how else to say it.
How did you make it?
Well, it's just, it's, nowadays they call them Spatzli. You know, you see
Small
recipes in German are Spatzli. That's the same thing. The only thing when you make them, you make the dough in a pan and you tip the pan with a knife, you know, make little.
Well, how did you though make knöpfli? Why don't you, for posterity, tell us though how you made knöpfli?
Make what?
Knöpfli. How you made them?
The Spatzli?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, I don't know, about 2 cups of flour, maybe an egg or two, and then water. Or you could use milk, but they almost got lighter when you used water. A little salt, not salt to it. And then you just, the pan, you just kind of tip a little bit. With a knife, you would make a little piece into the salted water. Then you let it come to a boil until it comes to the top. Then you served it with butter breadcrumbs.
Now, when you sliced it with the knife, did you moisten the blade a little before you sliced?
Yeah, I always have to dip the knife into the hot water every time you cut off, and then you have to dip the knife into the boiling water, so it wouldn't stick.
You know, a while ago you said about corn cobs. Jake Sider's mother, she did a lot of cooking with corn cobs, and they were hot and they were clean. You made a good clean fuel. You can tell her about it.
Well, I grew up. We didn't carry in wood. We had a wood cellar that we probably filled maybe every month, and our home was modern with electricity. But the cook stove that I grew up with is still in the home and it's workable.
Now something else that hadn't been spoken of, and that's a big thing. Everybody would they'd shoot the hog, and then they'd scrapers and scrape all the hair off. They put lye, or not lye, but they used the ashes to soften up the hair, and had big scrapers that scraped all the hair off of them. And then they were butchered and hung up in a tree, and they'd stay there till they cooled off, and they took them into they had a kind of a building by the next to the house, and there they had neighbors down there, and they had whole tables full of meat. It was all cut up, and they dry, and the best thing is making sausage, because they keep passing samples out until the flavor was just right. And the women would be running back and forth to the kitchen, and people would say, well, it needs a little more salt or pepper and so forth. And then they put it in this big sausage stuff. Have you ever seen them? You crank them down. Of course, the ladies, as soon as you butcher the hog in the morning, the women start cleaning the intestines for casings. And they would clean them out and turn them inside out, and you took a knife and you scraped all the lining off till they had them real thin. Then they kept them wet, and they put them in a sausage stuffer. And the sausage stuffer was a press, and then on the bottom was a long pipe, maybe about 8 inches long, and they kept stringing on this casing until, and then one person held the end of the casing shut, and as you screwed down the thing, it would push the meat into the casing, and then they would put that in the hams. They had what they call smoke houses, and they were small buildings, and they hung them on poles or boards, hooks, and let that smolder for weeks. And when they were completely smoked through, of course they were, then they just hung them up outside in the cellar during the summer. They wouldn't spoil. the smoke had preserved it. People didn't worry about E. coli and all that stuff. I don't think anybody got sick from it. And they would leave that meat all cut up that day and leave it out on a table somewhere in the shade or someplace and let that freeze. So they only thawed it up as they can. And back in those days, you put it in jars and hot bath, canning, and that's all the meat was canned, except there was another way of doing it, and that they had a big crock, probably 15-gallon ones or 10-gallon ones, and they put cooked meat in that and covered it up with lard, and that would keep all summer long too. I remember years ago we had a walnut tree by our house, and that's where we always hung the hogs and the beef. And when they skinned them, they had remnants of the meat. So there were little strips that didn't amount to anything, and some of the other parts of the tails. They kept the tails, but rectums and so forth. They had them, and they used to throw them up in the trees. And boy, I tell you, the chickadees and red-headed woodpeckers and all, they really had a banquet up there that lasted for many days, maybe weeks. The Swiss that came here, there were a lot of beekeepers. Pretty near all of them had bees. The Beedecoopers, Paul here, his dad always had bees, and there was Jake Beedecoop, and there was Dan Beedecoper, and Tofield Lehman. They all had bees. Another thing too, this is something that I bet people never knew either. Now, Tofield Lehman used to make vinegar, and all they did was take honey and let it, mix it with water and let it sour, and that turned into vinegar. In Apostolic Church here, the families took turns serving dinner. And I remember yet when my mother baked the bread and we churned the butter. And what they did for churn the butter, they had a shotgun can. I know most of them know what they are. They're about 8 inches across. They had various sizes. And then we had in fact, I got that shit, a plunger. You plunged up and down, and that's what churned the butter. And I remember it so well. Then when we were kids, we always liked the buttermilk so well. And they take this butter, take it out of the churn, and put it on a plate like a big baking board, and they rub that down and squeeze all the water out of it, and that was good butter. And I think I'm not sure. Oh yeah, there was always a section. Some of the old people didn't like salted butter, so my mother would always take a sample of the butter, or a small sample of it, for the older people, and they always had two sets of butter dishes on the table. One was salted and one was unsalted. And I guess that's it in that respect. Getting back to what you mentioned about going by buggies, and now nobody mentioned bobsled. We used to, my folks, I remember, went down through the woods and across the creeks and went to, when years ago they used to jack up the cars in the wintertime and then use the horses to go to church. And I remember real well, we used to build bobsled down through the woods. The trees were hanging with snow. And then later on toward the summer, we had buggies just like the Amish do now, and through the mud and everything. And down to our church here at that time, they had a lot of garages. I mean, they were horse stalls is what they were. Later on, when people started taking, before my time, when they first started taking cars to church, they would they wouldn't leave the car set outside during the service. They would put it inside in the garage.
So everybody said,
Yeah. This is sort of a memory of my youngest daughter whom we lost to cancer 2 years ago. But she took music lessons with Tony Beagle, but he also memory for him. And after they came back, I think Beulah would get them. And they stayed at, they were at your house one night. And then Ann came home and she said, we had the best soup. But she said, I can't figure out what it was. But, you know, it had those little strings of egg stuff down in the soup. She said, it didn't look good, but it sure tasted good.
It didn't look good. Yeah.
She really thought that was special.
Yeah, I still like the Italy soup.
Well, how do you make it?
Didn't you run that through a sieve?
No, we didn't. It was thin enough, it was egg and flour and milk, it was thin enough so you could pour it in slowly into the boiling water. Then it makes little bits all over them. Or some people didn't use much flour, then it actually looked like somebody vomited.
Well, it was always kind of thin, and then there'd be like a custard over the top. And,
Corn coop.
well, it was a corn broth. Yeah, that's what we always called it. And we ate that a lot pretty every morning, it seemed like.
I wonder if that's the same thing what my mother used to make, she called it fluted batch.
Yeah, what?
Batch.
What kind of that?
Fluted batch, it was kind of a crust on the net, and it was kind of, I suppose with eggs or something, it was kind of bubbled up. My wife, she's been trying to make that for years, and she can't do it.
I have a recipe for that.
A little story I told you about difference between German and High German and Swiss. Because years ago, my folks lived, and next door to them was an old lady, a Swiss lady, named Frau Mühlenthaler. But across the alley was a German Baptist minister, and they were High German all the way. And as usual in those days, the German church had a lot of rural people for members, and they'd bring them a live hog for them to butcher. And they were butchering one day, and my mother and this old lady Melodollar went over and were watching it, and they were talking to the pastor's wife there, and this old lady Melodollar, who was Swiss, she said, "My aber der hat viel Schmutz." And old lady the pastor's wife, she was insulted. She says, "Frau Mühlenthaler, wir doch nicht schmutzig." And the thing was that schmutz in Swiss was lard, and in German, it's dirt.